Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon if you're joining us from Asia. My name is John Nilsson-Wright. I'm the Career Foundation Fellow here at Chatham House and also an Associate Professor at Cambridge University. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to our webinar on offsetting the North Korean strategic challenge. Let me begin with just a few practical matters, just to remind you that this is being conducted on the record, not under the Chatham House rule, in other words. I also want to say a very warm thank you to our sponsors for this event, the Career Foundation and the Taejae Academy. To you, the audience, we have many people joining us today. You'll have the opportunity to ask questions of our panelists. Could I, as usual, encourage you to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. But let me begin by noting, of course, the timeliness of our deliberations today. You will have noticed that at 7 a.m. Seoul time, North Korea launched an ICBM, which is clearly a source of great anxiety in terms of the strategic balance within the region. An ICBM that reportedly traveled 1,000 kilometers, landing to the west of Japan. In terms of unpacking the motivations of the North Korean administration, this is always a challenge, but it seems two proximate events seem to be uppermost in terms of explaining this latest security provocation. First of all, the United States and South Korea are carrying out joint exercises as part of their long-standing alliance partnership to deal in part with the challenge of North Korea. And of course, also today, we have a historic meeting between the leaders of South Korea and Japan, the first time in over a decade that a South Korean president has traveled to Tokyo. One can't, I think, underestimate the significance of this meeting between America's two most important Northeast Asian allies. In part, this reflects arguably progress in resolving long-standing historical grievances, particularly a dispute over forced labor. And it also is a reflection of President Yoon's commitment since taking over as president to strengthen alliance relationships, not just with the United States, but also to think in terms of trilateral cooperation between Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo. And this is a very meaningful illustration of that commitment. From Japan's perspective, of course, looking ahead to the G7 summit in Hiroshima that Prime Minister Kishida will be hosting, this is a very important diplomatic achievement, signaling, I think, the commitment of Tokyo to take on a more proactive role in regional and global diplomacy. And for other actors, of course, for the Biden administration, which has placed such an importance on the significance of alliance cooperation, there will be, I think, a great deal of relief that Tokyo and Seoul are working so closely together. And also from a European and from a British perspective, on the back of Prime Minister Sunak's visit to San Diego and the announcement of the AUKUS agreement, Britain's engagement in the Indo-Pacific matters a great deal. And Britain's relationship with both Japan and South Korea has developed quite significantly in recent years. So I'm sure we will have opportunities to talk about not only the response to this immediate security challenge, but also the response of players within the region, but also other countries. We have a great panel of very knowledgeable experts. Let me introduce them in the order in which they will be speaking. First, Do-Yeon Kim, who's an adjunct senior fellow at the program at the Center for New American Security. She joins us from Seoul. And has written extensively on North Korea, most recently, I think, in the pages of Foreign Affairs. Dion, welcome. We're delighted to have you joining us. Secondly, Professor Gina Kim, who is currently Dean of the Division of Language and Diplomacy at Hanguk University of Foreign Language Studies. She has written extensively on defense issues, having previously been an analyst at the Korea Institute for Defense Analysis, and is also an adjunct professor at Yonsei University. Last but not least, Glyn Ford, a longtime North Korea watcher, former member of the European Parliament. In his work with his Brussels-based NGO Track 2 Asia, considerable experience not only in watching developments on the peninsula, but also working quite closely with the DPRK. So we have a wonderful panel. Without further ado, I'm going to hand the floor over to Do-Yeon Kim, who's going to kick off with her first remarks, about 3 to 5 minutes or so.
Thanks so much, John and Chatham House, for really this timely webinar, as you say, and also inviting me to join this distinguished panel of speakers. I'll just jump right in and offer some brief remarks, trying to address some of the key themes that are written in the program description. So any practical ways to try to reduce current tensions? Well, in order to answer this question, which is quite difficult at the moment, we need to first address why there are tensions. And so the first and foremost is North Korea continues to test and launch its missiles. And they have been since all throughout the pandemic, even before the pandemic, but they've really ramped up the speed and the frequency and the types of tests that they're conducting. And they seem to be really aimed at fundamentally to perfect their technology to make reliable tactical nuclear weapons, which is a big thing for their leader, ICBMs and other high-tech weapons that Kim Jong-un has ordered his country to make in his Eighth Party Congress. Against that backdrop, we were seeing the United States and South Korea under the current administration, they're bringing joint exercises back to normal, even strengthening them in some areas, in some key areas, all in response to North Korea's provocations, so that they're ready for any crisis situation and so that they can continue to deter North Korea from starting another war. And we're also seeing increasing US, Japan, South Korea coordination, which is good news. North Korea, China, and Russia all blame the US for recent and current tensions, but we should remember that North Korea ramped up its weapons tests and missile launches even when there was a South Korean government until last May that had a policy of appeasement toward North Korea, and the US and South Korea have been in reaction mode ever since then. So the ball really is in North Korea's court if we want to see a reduction in tensions, but it's unlikely that North Korea will stop its weapons tests and launches until it's satisfied with achieving certain milestones in nuclear weapons development, or until it gets everything it wants from the United States first. And those demands, at least during the Trump administration, were an end to all US-South Korea military drills, lifting of all sanctions, and even an eventual end to the US-South Korea alliance. Now, these were the same preconditions for any dialogue with Washington. Ever since President Biden came into office, there have been no diplomatic contacts to confirm whether these are the same preconditions for dialogue, but we can assume that they may actually be the same. And the Biden administration has made it very clear on numerous occasions through many channels and means that it is ready to talk anytime, any place without preconditions. But North Korea has either rejected or has not responded. So the two main questions now are how to stop North Korea from testing and how to bring North Korea back to the dialogue table. These are not new questions, and we've seen them here before at many different points in our history in dealing with North Korea. Stopping weapons tests is certainly difficult to do, especially when Beijing and Moscow are not willing to enforce their UN sanctions obligations, and when we're in a pandemic when North Korea has closed its borders. Since the first year of the pandemic, I've been suggesting that we strengthen sanctions for cyber crimes, including cryptocurrency, that are believed to finance North Korea's nuclear weapons program because it's difficult to enforce sanctions the traditional way due to the pandemic. It's good news to hear that Washington has recently begun focusing on them. And the conservative government in South Korea now, the new government, it would want to go towards maximum pressure at this time, but it's difficult to do that in the current geopolitical climate and the pandemic, which I will outline soon. Now, the second question is resuming dialogue, and this is also difficult because, as I mentioned, North Korea continues to refuse them. My theory since the start of the pandemic had been that North Korea does not want to contract the coronavirus through direct contact. So this is perhaps the most immediate reason why it was refusing to return to dialogue. So this is when I suggested to European friends who still maintain contact with North Korea to help educate them that there are safe ways to receive vaccines and eventually to encourage them that there are safe ways to have safe and direct diplomatic talks with Washington. But we've seen that North Korea has been squarely inward focused. And even if we were not in a pandemic, their preconditions for dialogue are non-starters for any American administration. Now, finally, we should continue to encourage Chinese and Russian officials to encourage North Korea to return to the dialogue table, but the current geopolitical situation with those countries, including the growing tensions between democracies and autocracies, has really complicated any chance for cooperation with Beijing and Moscow to make progress on the North Korean nuclear issue. So, I hate to be a downer here, but it's under the current realities, it's quite difficult to continue dialogue, even if it's dialogue for tension reduction purposes. But difficult, but still we need to look for openings, and we certainly need to continue to try to probe and look for opportunities with North Korea.
Dion, thank you very much. Notwithstanding your rather pessimistic assessment of the current situation, I'm sure we're going to want to come back and drill down in thinking about some of those practical measures where we can build on past contact. And of course, one of the big questions that I think everybody wants to know is, looking ahead to the possibility of a seventh nuclear test, why does deterrence not seem to be working in terms of keeping North Korea in a place where it is unable to engage in these provocations? But let's leave that to our discussion, and let's move on swiftly to Gina-Ke Kim, who is also in Seoul, of course, and can give us her perspective on the South Korean government's approach.
Yes, thank you. I truly thank Chatham House for this opportunity to be part of this wonderful dialogue. Well, let me share South Korea's perspective on the idea of renegotiating with the DPRK. South Korea announced the so-called BOLD initiative last year in August, and South Korea divided the whole negotiation process into many steps and designed corresponding measures accordingly. Before denuclearization talks, according to this plan, when North Korea returns to the table, South Korea's holistic approach to denuclearization through dialogue seeks to create an environment in which North Korea returns to renegotiation. And during the denuclearization negotiation process, the BOLD initiative steps and comprehensive agreements will be pursued. The ROK government aims to reach a very comprehensive agreement on denuclearization through negotiations. One of the initiatives includes measures such as resource and food exchange program. This is a mechanism that seeks sanctions waiver to allow the export of North Korean minerals resources within certain limits, so that North Korea can purchase basic necessities such as food and medicine. While denuclearization is undertaken, then more comprehensive measures will be sought. South Korea will offer corresponding measures that cover political, economic, and even military issues. Economic measures include improving power generation and distribution infrastructure, modernizing projects for seaports and airports for international trade, and upgrading hospitals and medical infrastructures, etc. This initiative also envisions diplomatic support for normalization of US-North Korea relations and discussions on control of conventional weapons system as well. But North Korea, immediately after this announcement, rejected this initiative and increased the frequency of its missile launches. And Kim Yo-jong said, North Korea will never deal with South Korea face-to-face. North Koreans are saying, leave us alone. So the question is why? In my opinion, first, North Korea's value to China increases in the current climate of tension between the US and China. And inter-Korean dialogue is unlikely as long as North Korea relies on its strategic alliance with China and Russia. Second, initiative is not an attractive proposition for North Korea, by the way. North Korea's key interest is military affairs. Regarding the possibility of dialogue with North Korea, many experts and scholars argue that a human security agenda centered on development, health, and food can possibly bring North Korea to the table, but there will be very limited opportunities to address hard security issues in the early stage of such a dialogue. Third, North Korea seems to be pleased, very pleased with the success in modernizing the KPA. In announcing its new nuclear policy, North Korea mentioned the establishment of a system for evaluating the life and performance of nuclear weapons, and a system for managing the safe storage of nuclear weapons and related administrative changes. This could be seen as an indication that North Korea is building a mechanism to systematically manage its nuclear arsenal, like other nuclear weapon states. And North Korea also hinted that it has operational plan at the tactical level, meaning that it has a nuclear warfighting strategy already. Fourth, North Korea wants to create a new equilibrium by overcoming some weaknesses in its conventional capabilities and maximizing its asymmetric superiority in its strategic capabilities vis-a-vis South Korea. Kim Jong-un emphasized very often that military modernization will create a stable environment that prevents a war on the Korean peninsula. He talks about strategic stability. And Kim Yo-jong claims that the development of its firearms, supersonic missiles, and military satellites are just a part of its long-term plan. And South Korea's midterm defense plan is similar because South Korea also develops tactical guided weapons, stealth fighter jet, SLBM capable submarines, etc. So the two Koreas know that these long-term plans cannot be revoked. So recently, I published an article with Toby Dalton from Carnegie on arms control linkage. The problem of the current pressure campaign is the clear lack of tangible results. I'm not saying that we should recognize North Korea as a nuclear weapon state, but we should think about some policy corrections, which may include dialogue to reduce the potential risk and consequences of deterrence failure through integrated nuclear conventional arms control, which North Korea may regard very, very attractive for future dialogue. And I look forward to more time to further discuss this matter. Thank you.
Gina, thank you very much. And also thank you for mentioning your article. I would want to encourage our audience to have a chance to read that, because I think it has some very interesting proposals in terms of practical ways forward. We'll want to come back, I think, to this really important question of North Korea's nuclear doctrine, because obviously that raises the question of the level of risk on the peninsula. We're seeing a leader who seems to be much more willing to, through at least declaratory policy, take a position that is potentially very, very destabilizing. So I'm sure we'll want to come back to that in the Q&A. But let's move to Glyn for a European perspective.
Yes, if at first you don't succeed, try diplomacy. It seems to me that there is no answer to the problem of North Korea that doesn't involve, if you want, diplomatic engagement. The argument is that North Korea is not prepared to engage. That's not true. North Korea is not prepared to engage with South Korea, the United States, and Japan. But there have been at least 3, if not more, attempts by the North Koreans to engage the European Union over the past couple of years. They proposed formally reopening the political dialogue, which was established back in 2001 when you had the visit by the EU Troika to North Korea when they met with Kim Jong-un. That dialogue's been suspended effectively since 2016. The North Koreans are asked to reopen it. There have been attempts to talk to the European Union about human rights. I suspect not from a very positive point of view. It was an attempt to try and talk to the European Union about not sponsoring resolutions on human rights at the United Nations, but nevertheless, there's been an offer of engagement, which has actually been rejected at EU level, principally because of, in my view, because of the pressure by certain member states, in particular France, to not have the EU engaged. So there is an opening to diplomacy there, which in a sense is being closed down, not in Pyongyang, but elsewhere. Secondly, in a sense, the nuclear deterrent is driven in the nuclear deterrent program in North Korea is driven by weakness, not by strength. We need to recognize that. There's this kind of image we see of North Korea as threatening, if you want, the ROK, Japan, and the United States. The reality is that I think South Korea's increase in its military budget the year before last was the equivalent of 50% of North Korea's military spending. They are massively outspent. They're the mouse in the corner, and if you want, the cat is the ROK, Japan, and the United States, or the cats. What they're trying to do is to develop a deterrent because their conventional forces are just not capable of, if you want, taking on the Republic of Korea, let alone the other part of the triad. I believe there is, what they're trying to do is to get to a position where they can start negotiations again with the United States. But to do that, they feel they need to be in a position where they can first reliably fire ICBMs that can hit the vast majority, if not the whole, of the United States. They need to have multiple warheads. And of course, as we saw at the recent military parade, they appear to be close to that in the sense that they've got about 11 or about a dozen of the long-range missiles and some evidence that they could put at least 4 warheads on each. That brings the United States into the game in a way that's not been before. The ICBMs are not a threat to the Republic of Korea or Japan. The North Koreans have long been able to hit the whole of the Republic of Korea and most of Japan with their short and medium range missiles. So this is the ICBM program is not about the peninsula. It's about Pyongyang-Washington relations. And when they get to the point where that seems to have been reliably demonstrated, then we may see some outreach there. The interesting thing with the next nuclear test is whether it's a small one or a big one. Because frankly, what they need to do is to test small nuclear weapons, because that will be much more worrying to Washington than anything else, because those are the warheads that they can put on their ICBMs. How do we get a solution? The North Koreans are obsessed with security guarantees, and the United States, understandably, and the ROK in Japan, with, if you want, denuclearization. The problem is they talk past each other. That's been the problem in the past, because the United States only wants to talk about denuclearization, and the Republic and North Korea only want to talk about, if you want, security guarantees. They have to both be on the table at the same time. The path to a solution is a long and narrow one. It absolutely won't be easy. Both security guarantees and, if you want, denuclearization will require multilateral involvement. This is going to have to be led, of course, by Washington and South Korea. But the reality is, security guarantee, the North Koreans do not trust the United States on security guarantees. I've been told very clearly that security guarantees are not a piece of paper signed by a US president, as well, Bill Clinton signed that, but then it got torn up by Bush. So it's going to have to be a different kind of arrangement. And I think it will look a little bit by the joint comprehensive plan of action with Iran, for good or ill. What they are looking for in terms of security guarantees will be the United Nations Security Council plus. In this case, it will be the Republic of Korea and Japan rather than Germany and the EU, as it was with the Iran deal. But that's going to be the kind of security guarantee that they're going to be looking for. So the P5 plus. But the other side of the equation is that North Korea is looking, like with the agreed framework, for some form of payment for into its economy. Now, the reality is, if one compares with the 4.5 billion that was offered with the agreed framework back in the mid-1990s, now you're probably looking, I used to say 15 to 20 billion. It's probably doubled now with what's been given to Ukraine. People have been very generous with Ukraine, and that's certainly seen the cash registers in Pyongyang, if you want, increasing prices. So we're probably looking at something like 20 to 30 billion. There's no way any US president is going to ask Congress, or if one was stupid enough to ask Congress, would get it through. So that means that it's going to be the Republic of Korea, maybe Japan, maybe the European Union, as we did with the Taejae program, actually making that payment. So in the end, it's a combination of the JCPOA and, if you want, a new agreed framework. That's the way forward. It's not going to be easy, but I don't see any other solution. The North Koreans they're not always, I mean, the tests are provoking, but they're not only designed to be provocative. They do pick convenient dates and whatever, but they have a missile program that needs testing if they're going to get to the point that they're aiming for. So we have to view these things as demonstrations of their progress in terms of developing their weapons, and not merely as a series of deliberate provocations where they're using up valuable resources to if you want, to annoy presidents in South Korea, the United States, and prime ministers in Japan.
Glyn, thank you very much for that very sort of comprehensive description of the situation and some thoughts about potential solutions. Let me just ask 3 questions, one to each of you, starting with Dion. I mean, from the vantage point of what you know about the political situation in Washington, and Glyn's observations about the very real limits in terms of any sort of financial package, I want to sort of step back and ask you, do you think on both sides of the aisle in the US, is there a kind of acceptance of what Glyn was saying, that North Korea is essentially acting out of weakness rather than strength? Because of course we've seen in the past a willingness on the part of some figures, I'm thinking of Lindsey Graham here, to actually embrace a much more assertive position towards the DPRK, with all of the talk of fire and fury being part of that agenda. If you're assessing the mood in terms of the Biden administration's approach, where do you see opportunities for Washington to engage in the way that Glyn Ford is suggesting, if any?
Well, okay, there were several questions embedded in that one question, so let me try to unpack some of those. When it comes to, is there a sense across the aisle on Capitol Hill, in an agreement, you're asking if North Korea is acting out of weakness and not out of strength. I don't think that's really the agreement. That's actually the issue right now on Capitol Hill. I think there's more across the aisle. I think there is bipartisan consensus that we actually need to be tougher on North Korea and not weaker on North Korea in terms of how we engage with North Korea. So I think there's growing consensus in the United States to act tougher. But certainly, you know, dialogue has always been on the table, and that's always been the preference and the first means and method for engaging with North Korea. And certainly the Biden administration, as I mentioned previously, has really countless occasions said that they, at very high levels, said that they want to continue dialogue. So you know, when we're talking about what is possible, we first need to have that conversation with North Korea, and same goes for Pyongyang. They should want to explore what is possible, but the only way to do that is to have a conversation with Washington. And so I think, you know, that's the biggest challenge and the biggest problem right now, is how to even resume that dialogue when it's pretty clear that North Korea is not interested, and they're squarely focused on their nuclear weapons advancement, modernization, and other internal factors beyond just security situation internally. They have an economic situation going on, and so I think that's the biggest challenge. And I know that, you know, my sense is the Biden administration is open to exploring various types of ways and means and packages and ways to formulate a deal, an eventual deal with North Korea, and to really try to hear what North Korea wants and try to find a solution forward that is in the interest of all parties. But again, we first need to have that conversation in a meeting first.
Thank you, Dion. I mean, it's striking that that you and Glyn are in different positions in terms of your assessment of the motivations of the North Koreans and their willingness to talk. So maybe we'll come back to that. But let me turn to Gina. On this question of North Korea's new nuclear doctrine, is there any evidence to actually support credibly that they have tactical nuclear weapons? And in terms of the method of control, one of the big concerns in terms of risk is to what extent Kim Jong-un is the principal decider. Has there been any delegation of authority to local commanders? Because typically, of course, we've assumed that there hasn't been. But what are the signals coming out of Pyongyang on those critical issues?
Well, according to this new law, North Korea regards deterrence as the primary function of the nuclear weapons, but North Korea at the same time rejected a sole purpose of nuclear weapons, while keeping the conditions for nuclear use very much ambiguous enough to allow for different interpretations of possible preemptive use in a crisis. But North Korea clarified the command and control system for nuclear weapons. It says the supreme leader of the DPRK has the sole authority to make all decisions regarding the use of nuclear weapons. So we assume that there is little chance of delegating such an authority to the field commander. But the problem here is the sole purpose of the nuclear use is denied because it says the conditions of nuclear use includes not only imminent nuclear attack, but also imminent WMD and non-nuclear attacks against the regime. And if it also says if the command and control system is endangered by such an attack by a hostile force, then it can use nuclear weapons. So it has broadened the conditions of nuclear first strike. So, and it also says regarding tactical nuclear weapons, it says a nuclear strike plan is automatically executed. It hints that at the tactical level, operational plan is in place, meaning that it has certain capability to use nuclear weapons for tactical purpose. That's my concern. Thank you.
Thank you. And obviously this is, I mean, there's both reassurance in the sense that the authority hasn't been delegated, but the scenarios in which nuclear weapons might be used by North Korea has now expanded. So that's obviously raising concerns in South Korea. And we've heard President Yoon talk very explicitly about the possibility of South Korea acquiring its own nuclear capabilities, with public opinion supportive of that idea. How credible do you think that is? How concerned should we be about the risk of an escalating arms race within the region?
I actually retracted that remark, and there were lots of discussions about South Korea's going nuclear, and some people with enough knowledge about the consequences of going nuclear talks about huge cost involved. So my interpretation of such a remark is perhaps South Korea is playing a two-level game. Internally, South Korean leadership wants to show some commitment in the defense of South Korean security. But at the same time, it wants to get the US to be more serious about its commitment in the defense of South Korea by forward deploying strategic assets in this region. So perhaps for further negotiations to strengthen extended deterrence. That's my interpretation.
Okay. Glyn, before we open up to the floor, one question for you in terms of the European role, in terms of facilitating dialogue. Of course, as we know, there have been lots of actors, the Scandinavians, Britain in the past, of course. We've had 20 years plus of diplomatic ties. Who, if anyone, is best placed within the European context, not just the European Union, but individual European states, do you think, to play a role, if there is such a role for European actors, in trying to get us out of this impasse?
Well, I mean, there's been a change of power in Sweden. So the Swedish commitment is with the new government is as yet untested. there's also a concern that the North Koreans have reacted badly to Sweden and Finland applying to join NATO, because Sweden obviously used to be a neutral country. The obvious actor is possibly the Austrians, who remain neutral and have an engagement with the North Koreans, if you're not talking about Europe as a whole. So of course, I think were the Germans to want to get engaged, but there's no sign of that at the moment, that they would be welcome. So that there are, or even the EU as a whole. But the problem with Brussels, in a sense, is that there is heavy resistance from individual member states. I mean, in terms of some of the other questions you raised, I mean, I think Seoul has lost the plot in terms of cause and effect. I mean, they're concerned about, if you want, command and control of nuclear weapons, but they also have a decapitation strategy. So in the United Kingdom, the Prime Minister, when elected, writes a sealed note as to what to do if there is a decapitation strategy in the UK and he or she is no longer in contact with our armed forces. And we don't know what that note says. But I know what Kim Jong-un's note says, and Kim Jong-un's note is not surrender. Kim Jong-un's note is throw everything at the South Koreans, the Japanese, and the United States. What they're trying to do with their ICBM program is to change the terms of extended deterrence, because the view is that the US was serious about defending the Republic of Korea and Japan if they weren't threatened. Now, once they are threatened, then there's a lot less certainty about whether the US would be prepared to really engage if you're, instead of Seoul being threatened with nuclear weapons, it was Los Angeles, Washington, or New York. The North Koreans are fully in favor of South Korea going nuclear, because they think that will actually unpick that alliance. So everyone who talks about going nuclear in the South, actually you've got a lot of support in Pyongyang.
Interesting, Glyn. I mean, in a sense, I think you've answered the question that Edward Howell wanted to raise, which is if denuclearization talks have previously failed due to issues about verification, thinking about the six-party talks, is there any possibility that the North Koreans would even contemplate denuclearization? So that's a question to all three of you. Is there a scenario, and what would some sort of arms control agreement with North Korea look like in terms of its capacity, its nuclear arsenal, and how would it be monitored? That's a key question. So perhaps starting with Gina to think about that issue.
I was thinking about arms control because, South Korea and of course the US has been emphasizing deterrence and extend deterrence. The problem with this is that, North Korea believes that it has the upper hand in the contest of wills, and it will not be deterred anyway, right? To avoid arms racing and crisis escalation risk, we can think about comprehensive arms control that will put some restraints not only on North Korean nuclear weapons, but on the conventional military capabilities of the ROC military. Previously, South Korea made numerous attempts to discuss conventional arms control, but failed to make some meaningful results. Because North Korea becomes a nuclear armed state, conventional arms control between the North and South should be linked closely with nuclear discussions between the US and North Korea. Because first, the growing arsenals of dual-capable ballistic and cruise missiles possessed by North Korea and South Korea blur the physical boundaries, of conventional and nuclear capabilities. And second, North Korea pursues arms racing, which is not only nuclear, but also conventional, which gives North Korea the ability to pursue an asymmetric escalation strategy against the South Korea. So a very comprehensive arms control effort can blunt the potential for North Korea to operationalize its strategy. And third, North Korea's distrust of US commitment on determining US hostile policy toward North Korea can be relaxed to a certain extent with the parallel disarmament efforts. by linking nuclear and conventional military arms control negotiations, we can prevent North Korea from playing one track off the other. I mean, conventional arms control negotiation between two Koreas of the other, which means nuclear negotiation between US and North Korea. So I think there should be a tighter policy planning and coordination between South Korea and the US when discussing integrated nuclear conventional arms control, which should include increasing measures, include measures that increasing predictability about future actions by both parties, pre-negotiation of military activities through hotlines and periodic meetings among military officers, and permitting monitoring and verification system, and reciprocal visits, inspections, and overflights, etc. So it should be a very comprehensive measures to be included.
Thank you, Gina. I mean, those are really very specific suggestions. Dion, again, from Washington's perspective, do you see an appetite for that sort of coordinated, integrated approach? We've seen a real proliferation of meetings trilaterally between South Korean, Japanese, and US officials. Last September, the Extended Deterrence Group, very important in terms of deterrence, but in terms of thinking about these sorts of concrete arms control proposals, do you see much discussion in Washington about them?
Well, first, we've got experts on the outside, but also perhaps even a debate on the inside the government. You've got those who are advocating for complete denuclearization. Then you have those who say, rather than complete denuclearization or leading with that, let's have arms control talks instead. My argument here is that it's not either or. It's arms control has always been part of every agreement with North Korea. It's always been the first step towards, or the first several steps, whatever you want to call them, but it's always been the first in the process towards denuclearization. So this is not new. Now, classical arms control measures, and even confidence and security building measures, and the specific steps that Gina eloquently outlined, it'd be great if we can have them. But the problem is first getting North Korea to be interested in them. And I think right now in the current climate, they are not interested. And second, I think North Korea has been showing that their definition of arms control is not the ones that is not the same as ours, meaning they seem to want mutual reductions in nuclear weapons with the United States. And this is the Cold War style between the Soviet and the United States, right? So it's not things like pre-notification of exercises or observations or things like that. And so this points to something that, a comment that I have in reaction to a point that Glenn made. It's a smart comment regarding, it seems they want some sort of JCPOA style, or they could be interested in a JCPOA style agreement. But my argument to that is I don't think North Korea would want a JCPOA style agreement, because JCPOA the verification measures are too intrusive for what North Korea would ever agree to. Verification, we've seen during the six-party talks process, we didn't even get close to real verification, but that's they have shown the strongest allergic reaction and opposition to any type of verification. And that's because transparency is the kiss of death for North Korea. And second, JCPOA placed limits, but it doesn't look like North Korea wants any small limited program. It's pretty clear that North Korea wants a full-fledged nuclear weapons program and not limits or restraints. And so I think that's the difference, and that poses a difficult problem. Now, if we're able to even have these conversations in person, my sense is that Washington would be open to discussing all these good practical steps. But again, currently, I'm very skeptical that North Korea would be interested in entertaining these if any of these measures, one, gave Washington too many eyes and ears into their program, and two, if it meant that North Korea could not be a full-fledged nuclear weapon power.
Thank you, Dion. I want to come to Glyn now to sort of respond to your points, but also bring in a question from John Everard. former British ambassador to the DPRK, who asks you, Glyn, specifically, you talk about the DPRK being satisfied with security assurances from the P5, but John asks, well, to what extent is the DPRK going to be convinced that the countries involved in any such deal would be able to hold the United States back from attacking North Korea? So we come back again to this fundamental sense of trust and vulnerability. Is there anything that can be part of that sort of negotiation which would provide that reassurance? And it goes to the point about verification that Dion raised in terms of how you make sure that both sides are being sufficiently transparent.
Well, I mean, as I said earlier, it's a long and narrow path to denuclearization of North Korea, and and everyone talks about how do we start on the denuclearization. Nobody, if you want, in the West talks how do we start on providing the security guarantees. So maybe that change. Yeah, John's entirely right. I mean, one would have to convince the North Koreans, and they're going to be hard to convince, but they're absolutely convinced that they can't trust the United States. At least, as I said, they had the letter from President Clinton that effectively that letter was torn up by Bush the elder when, if you want, he tore up the agreed framework. But the agreed framework, which lasted a short decade, cost about $1 billion when it wasn't even paid for by Washington. It was paid for principally by South Korea, Japan, and the small change came from the European Union. And that put back the North Korean nuclear program for 8 or 10 years. If that agreed framework hadn't been in place, we'd be in a very different position with North Korea. If we could negotiate a freeze on nuclear testing, long-range missile tests, plutonium production, and possibly HEU production, we'd be in a much better place down the road than we are now. Even if that fell apart as part of a much longer term step-by-step deal. I mean, yes, you're entirely right. The North Koreans are deeply suspicious about American intrusion in terms of verification into North Korea. They still remember the Pauli Commission from back in the late 1940s that came in to check that the Russians weren't repatriating industrial goods from North Korea back to Moscow. And it came in, it did an assessment and actually said, no, the Russians aren't repatriating industrial goods. But the results of that commission were used for targeting bombing during the Korean War. So they've got a very practical example of, if you want, intrusion having adverse consequences. Now, they did offer, we can argue about it, to give up the whole of the curtilage of the Yongbyon site in Hanoi. 200 buildings, the sole sources of production of plutonium, which if you want, is the main problem. I know HEU's there as well, the main problem. That's the kind of first step, but that was a first step that was rejected by President Trump. I don't know how you get to the second step without going through the first step.
We haven't spoken much about other regional actors, and there are two questions on China, one from Michael Dillon and Matthew Kennedy, essentially asking the same point, which is, as a result of this new dialogue between Seoul and Tokyo that we're seeing unfolding today, is there any sense that this is going to shift China's thinking? China is North Korea's, of course, principal ally, at least nominally. Are the Chinese a potential player in terms of reaching some sort of progress in trying to lower security tensions? Maybe start with Gina and see how you see things from the vantage point of Seoul in terms of China's role.
Well, what North Korea demands is to recognize North Korea as a normal state and stop threatening regime change. And in military terms, to replace the Armistice Treaty with a peace agreement. In economic terms, not to ask for it is not asking for assistance, but just lifting sanctions and let North Korea rebuild itself. So these are not something that South Korea can do alone. So whatever we propose, North Korea will be saying, don't be presumptuous, because South Korea is not the ones who can resolve all these issues. To keep the stability of the region on the Korean Peninsula, I think China is a key player. And still, South Korea needs China's help on this issue. But now we are leaning toward US and Japan, because North Korea is not interested in all this dialogue, all these propositions, all these suggestions by South Korea. So this time we are working closely with the US and Japan to deter North Korea. But in the future, when there is a time for opening up a dialogue, then we should think about cooperating with China on resolving North Korea issue.
Okay, thank you. Dion, any thoughts on this question? Is China
Yeah,
any signs?
yeah, I agree with Gina. Just a few points to add is, China certainly cannot solve the problem, but they certainly are an important player, and we've seen this in the past. When Beijing has the will to act and enforce, they can enforce their influence and have actual practical influence over Pyongyang. In other words, we have seen Beijing dial up and down the sanctions lever when it chooses to, and when they tighten the sanctions, or at least enforce the sanctions, then we've seen North Korea move. And even with the post-2016 UN Security Council sanctions, for the first time in a long time, or perhaps even the first time, we saw Beijing proactively enforce those sanctions during Fire and Fury, and then we saw an opening, and we saw all the summer tree happen. And then, of course, the sanctions regime started to unravel again because Beijing started to loosen sanctions on North Korea. But that's been a tool that Beijing knows it can use. It has used it before, but it refuses and it chooses not to. And especially under the current geopolitical climate that I mentioned earlier, it just doesn't seem that Beijing has the will to continue to enforce and exercise its influence. But I think this is something that we should continue to remind Beijing that North Korea's nuclear weapons advancements and their weapons are not only aimed at the United States. Considering the long history, the long, difficult and distrustful history between Korea and Beijing, North Korea's nuclear weapons could also be aimed at China too. And the more North Korea's nuclear weapons advance, the more the United States is going to want to increase its presence in the region. So that should be an argument or a point to make to Beijing, that if Beijing doesn't want to see more American presence, like whether it's missile defense or strategic assets or others, then Beijing should help. But we're not seeing them help on the North Korea problem.
And of course, another concern for Beijing is that the persistence of the North Korean challenge is being taken by policymakers in Japan as an opportunity to see this vastly expanded defense commitment that we've seen under Prime Minister Kishida. At times, despite the fact that the North Korean threat is the proximate cause, others have worried that this is driven primarily by concern over China. So to what extent does China worry about the danger that Japan's own defense posture is changing? Is that part of its calculation? We have a question from Matthias Batoman, who's essentially arguing that to a degree, the Japanese response is being hyped up within Tokyo. So first of all, in terms of threat assessment, how does is Japan guilty of, in a sense, over-dramatizing the North Korean challenge for these additional reasons? And from China's perspective, how much anxiety is there that the shifting position of Japan, let alone the United States, is another reason to be more engaged with the North Korean issue? So that's, maybe I'll turn to Glyn to address that first of all.
Yes, I mean, I think the Japanese position is, the Japanese have taken the opportunity of North Korea to do something about the defensive relationship with China. I think it probably would have happened anyway, but if North Korea wasn't there, the Japanese would be in favor of inventing it. Secondly, we have a problem. I mean, it's the only way you're going to persuade the Japanese to ignore Article 9 of the Constitution. They still have Article 9 there. They're not going to have a referendum in Japan, at least not yet, because they'd actually lose it. But nevertheless, they're increasing their defense, they're doubling their defense budget. The Chinese-North Korean relationship is a strange one. I've been with Kang Suk-ju in Pyongyang when he said the North Koreans are willing to fight the Chinese. This was back in 2016, when, if you want, the Chinese were building refugee camps on the border, and American chiefs of staff were actually visiting Jilin province because there was an expectation of, if you want, some kind of collapse in the north. The Chinese are completely committed to the north not collapsing. They want to keep them on lean rations, and there's some evidence that there's serious hunger in North Korea, but they're not going to allow North Korea to collapse, because the view is that will mean that you'll end up with US troops on the Yellow River. The Chinese are as equally unconvinced that they can trust the Americans on this as anybody else, having seen what's happened in Eastern Europe with, if you want, all those countries that were not going to be allowed to join NATO actually being in there. So the whole Ukrainian-Russian conflict has taught lessons to China. So yeah, the Chinese are part of the problem and part of the solution. As soon as Beijing takes its eye off North Korea, certainly people in Jilin province, which is very economically dependent on North Korea, start, if you want, trading in goods again. I mean, North Korea is likely to open up in the coming months. We're for the first time, I certainly anticipate there'll be foreign guests going into Pyongyang for the 27th of July, which of course is the 70th anniversary on their side of victory in the Fatherland Liberation War, and from everybody else, the date of the armistice in 1953.
In all of this, we're talking primarily about the big questions, the structures, the kind of risk calculations that North Korea and other countries are engaging in. But we haven't spoken very much about personalities. There is one question from Dina Mufti, about Kim Jong-un specifically. The question is, which individuals does Kim Jong-un look up to and respect? Are any of them capable of being mediators? Glyn, again, given your contact with the government, is there any sense that there are personalities in particular that could have disproportionate influence in terms of reaching some sort of agreement?
Please don't say Dennis Rodman.
I was going to say not Dennis Rodman. I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm rather impressed with Sig Hecker rather than Dennis Rodman. I don't think Kim Jong-un particularly knows him, but of course he was the one American as former head of Los Alamos who was actually allowed in on, I think, 5 or 6 occasions, all of which was just been written up in his book Hinge Points. So he had a good relation and trusted relationship. I think it might be someone like him rather than Dennis Rodman, but I'm not sure there is any one individual outside of North Korea that we could reliably talk to Kim Jong-un, frankly.
Just as we're almost out of time, but Gina and Dion, any thoughts on this question? I mean, we've, of course, just thinking historically, there have been some surprises. It was, of course, in 2002 and 2004 that we had then Japanese Prime Minister Koizumi meeting with Kim Jong-il. It's hard to see anyone in a Japanese context who would play that role. But I mean, if you think outside the box, are there any individuals that we might want to consider as potential mediators or go-betweens? Starting with Gina, and then Dion, you'll have the last word.
No, for this question, I have no answer. But for the previous question, I have additional thoughts. Well, China's historical memory of Japanese expansion would be a very serious one, and China would be very cautious about Japan's militarization. Of course, Japan changed its key documents, and we can see more U.S. forces in Japan, more assets visiting Japan, but it'll take time for Japan to achieve huge improvement of its military capabilities. I'm not underestimating Japan's capability, but the fast change in Japan is not only driven by North Korean threats. And discussions of division of labor among key allies in the Pacific is taking place among not only Japan, but also Australia, NATO allies, Philippines, and many others. So I think Japan is not the only problem here.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Dion, final word to you.
Oh, yeah, not the question about personalities, but, you know, I think Japan has legitimate concerns when it comes to threats it perceives from Beijing and Pyongyang. And so they're doing what they are doing because of their threat assessments. And so to answer your question, John, I mean, that's another point that Beijing should consider. If they don't like what they're seeing from Japan and the United States and South Korea together, that should be cause for some motivation to try to help with the North Korea problem. But again, we're in this geopolitical situation, and I think it was Gina who said that Beijing perhaps sees nuclear North Korea as a strategic asset, and I've also published along those lines too, and I agree, especially in this climate right now. So that makes it difficult. I do want to, I think, remind everyone that we mentioned deterrence several times throughout this program, and as a matter of policy, deterrence and extended deterrence the target has always been to dissuade or prevent another invasion or an attack against South Korea by the North, and that remains to be true. And I think so far it's been working, but the challenge now and continues to be how to stop weapons tests. And so I think if South Koreans and its South Korean government continue to see more advancements in North Korea's nuclear weapons capability, coupled with their South Koreans' perception that the United States, whoever's in office, that the United States is not being proactive enough to solve the problem, then I think those two factors together will continue to drive what we're seeing as demands, South Korean demands for their own nuclear weapons, or demands for the return of tactical US nuclear weapons, or demands for some sort of NATO nuclear sharing arrangement or NATO nuclear planning group. And so those are the two, I think, fundamental factors that are driving a lot of the anxieties and insecurities in South Korea, and they need to be addressed.
Thank you. And your final point, Dion, I think reminds me of the importance of thinking about perception, both in a contemporary context, but also historically. How often states in this very volatile region have seen one another's motivations in very different terms. I mean, I think that's illustrated in the differences even in this panel, in terms of your own assessments of what's driving some of the decisions of individual actors. There isn't really a clear consensus, other than the fact that we're dealing with a very potentially high-risk situation, and we don't have any immediate solutions or any necessarily immediate roadmaps out of the current predicament. So unfortunately, we have to end on a pessimistic note. The one glimmer of optimism, if Glyn is right, North Korea is going to open up, and we're going to see at least an opportunity for some sort of dialogue, maybe not between governments, maybe between private citizens. Let's hope that at least offers a glimmer of light in what is a very dark and threatening situation at the moment. But thank you all very much for your really insightful observations, for fielding the questions so well. Thank you, the audience, for joining us. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all the questions, but I think it's been a very illuminating and stimulating discussion, and I hope we'll have more opportunities in the future to continue this dialogue. Thank you all again, and wherever you may be, have a good evening or enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.